Sara is a final year PhD candidate in computer and mathematical science at Caltech. She's actually defending next Friday, 9 a.m. Her research focuses on building computer vision methods that enable global scale biodiversity monitoring. She's a leading voice in the wild labs and conservation communities, working hard to make AI accessible to conservationists. And she's also a member of our advisory committee for the Tracking Progress project. She'll be providing a brief introduction to the topic today ahead of our other speakers. Sara, do you want to take over?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you, but can everyone see Sarah's slide? Because I can't.
This is no here.
Okay, good. There you go. You're good.
Yeah. Google does this thing where it sort of like unpins if you're not paying attention for long enough. But if you move the slides, it pins it back to the top. Yeah, so I'm basically planning to just talk about kind of the space of data analysis, but at a high level, and really try to introduce some of the large challenges and like open questions that there are in the field. But I'm leaving the digging deep into the methods for the other speakers. So really just trying to give a reasonably high level intro. And mostly focused on some of the big challenges that we face when we're sort of trying to do data analysis, but really scale up in many different dimensions. So I think the first important point is that movement ecology is both young, but growing exponentially. This is a figure from a paper just a couple of years ago that's showing significant exponential growth in the number of articles that are submitted around movement ecology each year. And in my opinion, a huge amount of this growth actually can be attributed to the substantial and really worthwhile efforts of the community to try to build open access and open standards for sharing movement data, through things like MoveBank, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But one of the things that comes with scale usually is growing pains, one way or another. And I think that there are a couple different interesting challenges of scale when we talk about movement ecology. So the first one is on the large side, large scale. So this is a visualization from MoveBank that's showing all of the different movement data that is in this amazing centralized platform. And if you look at the numbers, MoveBank, as of earlier this year, had 3.5 billion animal locations, 3.6 billion other animal-borne sensor measurements. That's everything from, audio monitors on the collars, sometimes images, lots of different types of data, lots of diversity of data that's in this central platform. Over 6,900 studies. So just showing the breadth of the different research groups that are actively interested in using this type of data, and 1,178 different taxa. And so as you start to move up to the scale of billions of data points with this much diversity and this many different projects, which often means different types of sensors, different sampling rates, different accuracies, and with different taxa, the challenges of understanding how to combine information across these studies with some of the sampling biases that might be in effect. I think that that's where we really end up needing some really careful statistical methods and the development of new methods that can actually be computationally efficient at these scales. And then I think one of the other really challenging aspects of scale when you talk about movement ecology is actually the fact that in some dimensions, it's truly small scale. And here, what I'm talking about is the fact that with most of these GPS tracked signals, what you're getting is movement of a single animal of a species, or maybe a set of animals of a species. But in order to get that data, you have to go and actually place sensors on animals. And that's invasive. It's expensive. For example, I work a lot with the Mara Elephant Project, and every elephant collar costs them about $25,000. It's dangerous. In order to collar animals, I have a friend who has to lean out of helicopters flying through forests trying to shoot tranquilizers at wolves. This is not a safe thing for humans to be doing. And it's also temporary. There's no such thing yet as sensors that actually are able to run continuously without running out of power running out of data, like dealing with data bandwidth issues, and also trying to figure out how to store and recover some of this data. And so movement ecology is both challenging from a large scale perspective, but also a small scale perspective. And I don't think it would be reasonable to expect that we're ever going to get to the point where we have collars on every single animal that exists on Earth. And so when you talk about these interesting dimensions of small scale, that's where you actually start running into these common problems with generalizability when you are thinking about processes for automating data analysis. So one way that we can think about the generalizability of data analysis is actually generalizing things like behavior categorization from movement data to new individuals within a population. So there are studies that are actually looking at individual preferences or habits in the types of behavior that's exhibited. And it is definitely the case that if you build behavior categorization for a track from a single individual in a species, there's not a guarantee that that method will not somehow overfit to that specific animal's behavior. And so we have to be very careful when we think about how generalizable the methods are, even within a single type of species, just elephants, for example, to being quite robust to then working off the shelf when we put a collar on a new individual. There's also generalizability challenges when we think about generalizing to new species. This is a really beautiful figure from a recent paper by Walter Yetz's group. And what you can see is that the types of movement data that we get from different species are very different. And this has to do with what's possible to put on a species. You can't put the same sort of power and bandwidth capacity on something that's going onto a bird because it needs to be quite lightweight. So these differences in what's actually possible for the sensor platforms themselves, the hardware, introduces some challenges generalizing to new species. But then also, what is feeding behavior from movement data for species across the board? What we don't really want when we think about economies of scale is for us to need to build a huge labeled, human ground truth labeled training data set over 100 different collared individuals of every species to be able to recognize behavior for that species in a robust way. So how do we actually share information across this movement data for different species to get to systems that are more easily adaptable and generalizable? And then the final dimension of generalizability is actually generalizing to new tasks. Many researchers have different questions they want to ask with this data. And so, if you're interested in behavior, which I think many people are, that means different things depending on your research question. You're interested, and some people are interested in more complex behaviors. So not just, is this animal at this time resting or eating, but things like, how are animals learning over time? Can you actually get at these sort of second order behaviors, things like learning to avoid human populations, for example? And also, can we learn to predict animal behavior? So actually look into the future. And these types of, these are just two examples of hundreds of different potential tasks, potential types of information we might want to extract from this really rich repository of data. And so there's this other question of, how do we build methods that are easily adaptable also to new tasks? Because I think all of us are aware that we have limited resources. So we're not going to be able to build, massive training data sets for every potential task. Another big challenge is just data quality. When you talk about all of these different types of sensors, they all have different types of errors that can be incurred. And I really liked this example of just different ways that people incorporate data cleaning into their processing pipelines. And you need to be sure that your method is somehow not overfitting to a specific type of data noise that might occur. Another really interesting and open challenge, I think, in this space is how do we incorporate additional information we might have beyond just this time series, geospatial signal. So that can be stuff like covariates, environmental factors that might actually play a large role in something like forward prediction or behavior analysis. Things like social information. For social species, if you actually have a sparse number of individuals that are tracked, but you understand something about the social network, what can that tell you about the movement of the population as a whole? And also non-invasive methods of tracking, things like visual re-identification for populations, where now potentially you might be able to get tracking signal for individuals you don't need to collar. But of course, that's going to be more sparse because you don't, unless you, I guess, fly a drone around behind a zebra, which is probably not going to be a long-term sustainable solution. And then finally, I think there's a lot of interest in moving to real-time analysis. So, it's great if you collect, hundreds of thousands of data points from an individual. Somehow you go and get that data off the collar, maybe with some bandwidth limitations. But especially for at-risk populations, you'd like to know, for example, when an elephant is under stress, so that you could actually, actively intervene and try to mitigate human-wildlife conflict or poaching. And there has been some recent interest in building TinyML, edge-based machine learning for spatiotemporal data, collars that are actually doing analysis in real time locally on device. And then you can kind of make optimal bandwidth decisions about what information you send. But again, now we need to figure out how to take these models and actually compress them and build them in ways that are accessible on the edge. And then, my final plug, which is basically something that I feel like I'm always proselytizing in this community, is that there is no such thing as a method that should just be trusted after it works well on a benchmark data set. So all of these things need validation and quality control. If you build a system that's recognizing behavior for a specific time period, you need to have a plan from the beginning for how you're going to make sure that that model is still valid next year and the year after. And if it starts to drift, if you start to see that there are inaccuracies that are building up due to correlations you learned in the first place that are no longer true in a changing world, then we need methods for actually adapting those models on the fly efficiently so that we still are building with human AI together trustworthy systems for analysis of this very large scale data. And if you're actually developing AI methods or using AI methods for movement data, I'm just plugging that we have an AI for Conservation Slack community that's a really great place to have big discussions about the nitty-gritty details of like what data you're using, the methods you're using, any questions you might have. So if you are interested in joining that community, it's close to 1,000 researchers globally now who do AI methods for ecology. You can email aiforconservation@gmail.com. And I stole basically every single picture in this intro. So these are the people you get who you should be giving credit to for all the visuals. Awesome. Yeah, really looking forward to the talks from the different speakers.